He asked if he could sit beside me at 9:47 on a Tuesday morning, and he asked the way children ask things when they already knew the answer, not tentatively, not performing the asking, simply stating what they intended to do and using the question as the courtesy that the intention required. "Can I sit here?" He was 7 years old and he had a white cane and he could not see me. He had found me the way blind people sometimes found things that sighted people missed, by listening. The waiting room of the Board of Veterans' Appeals hearing office in Boise, Idaho had 8 chairs and 6 other people in it, and he had walked to the chair beside me specifically. His father came in 30 seconds behind him, slightly out of breath, the specific quality of a parent who has been following a 7-year-old with a white cane through a federal building and who has learned to follow rather than lead. He said, "Oliver, there are other seats." Oliver said, "He's quiet. I want to sit here." His father looked at me. I said it was fine. His father sat down across the room with the specific apologetic quality of a parent who understood that his child had made a reasonable decision and that the apology was for the inconvenience of the decision-making process rather than the decision itself. Oliver settled into the chair beside me, with the specific practiced efficiency of a child who had been navigating spaces without vision for his entire life and who had developed, in the navigating, a physical competence that most sighted children did not have. He said, "Is that a dog?" I said, "Yes." He said, "What kind?" I said, "German Shepherd." He said, "Can I touch him?" I said, "You can ask him." He said, "How do I ask a dog?" I said, "Hold your hand out. He'll decide." Oliver held his hand out, low, palm up. Atlas, 3 years old, 78 pounds, trained for 2 years by a nonprofit in Boise and placed with me 18 months ago, extended his nose and touched it to Oliver's palm. Then he pressed his head against Oliver's hand. Oliver said, "He said yes." I said, "Yes, he did." Oliver scratched Atlas behind the ear with the specific confident touch of a child who had been told how to approach dogs and who had internalized the instruction so completely that it had become instinct. He said, "What's his name?" I said, "Atlas." He said, "Like the map book?" I said, "Like the thing that holds the world up." Oliver thought about this. He said, "That's a good name for a dog." I said, "I thought so." We sat for a while. The waiting room was the specific quality of government waiting rooms, functional, fluorescent, the accumulated weight of people who had come here to ask for things they needed and who were waiting to find out whether they would receive them. After a while, Oliver said, "Why are you here?" I said, "I have a hearing. I'm appealing a decision." He said, "What kind of decision?" I said, "A decision about how much help I need." He thought about this. He said, "I'm here because my dad got the wrong floor." I said, "Where were you trying to go?" He said, "Social Security, for my eyes." I said, "This is the veterans floor." He said, "I know, Dad figured it out, but I wanted to stay." He scratched Atlas again. He said, "I'm going to be a guide dog trainer when I grow up." I said, "That's a good job." He said, "I know, I've already decided." At 10:04, the clerk opened the hearing room door and called my name. Oliver said, "Is that you?" I said, "Yes." He said, "Good luck." I looked at this 7-year-old boy who had found me by the sound of my breathing, and who had scratched my service dog behind the ear, and who had told me he had already decided what he was going to do with his life. I said, "Thank you, Oliver." I went in. I want to tell you who Sam Ritter was before the hearing room, and before Atlas, and before the specific Tuesday morning that changed what the VA understood about the distance between functioning and fine. Because the distance matters, and most people who have not lived it do not understand how large it is. I grew up in Boise. My father had been in the Army and had come back from Vietnam the specific way that men of his generation came back from Vietnam, which was carrying something that did not have a name yet, and that the country was not yet equipped to help with. He had managed. He had been present. He had loved us in the specific way of someone who was doing the best they could with tools that were insufficient for the task. I had understood this with increasing clarity as I got older and had enlisted in 2011 at 21 with the specific combination of family history and genuine conviction that the Army was where I was supposed to be. I was not wrong about this. I was in the Army for 8 years, 2 deployments to Afghanistan, 2013 and 2015, As an infantry soldier, and then as a small unit leader when I made sergeant, I was good at the work. I was present for my soldiers. I came home from both deployments intact in the specific way that intact meant when you had been in places where intact was not guaranteed. I left the Army in 2019, not because I wanted to, because Kate was pregnant and we had decided that a deployed father was not what our family needed in its first year, and that the deployment cycle was not going to stop, and that the decision needed to be made. I had made it without regret. I had made it because Kate and the coming child were the clearest thing I had, and I was going to organize my life around the clearest thing I had. Kate died in June 2021. Hypertrophic cardiomyopathy, a condition in which the heart muscle thickens abnormally, sometimes causing sudden cardiac death in otherwise healthy people. She had not known she had it. The cardiologist told me afterward that it was the kind of condition that could go completely undetected for decades and that sometimes expressed itself in the first significant physical stress event. Kate had been running. A Thursday evening run? The specific Thursday evening run she had been doing for 2 years, 5 miles through the Boise foothills. She did not come home. Jack was 5 years old. I've thought many times about the specific arithmetic of this, the decision I made in 2019. To leave the Army so Jack would have a present father, and the fact that Kate died in 2021, which meant that the decision I made to give Jack 2 present parents had instead given Jack 1 parent, which was me, which was a good thing in the sense that I was there, and a specific kind of loss in the sense that the person I was there alongside was gone. I think about this on Thursday evenings. The PTSD had been there before Kate died. I had been diagnosed in 2020, the year after I left the Army, when the structure of military service was no longer providing the specific external scaffolding that had allowed me to function without addressing the internal architecture. The diagnosis had not surprised me. I had known something was different for years and had managed it with the tools available, which were inadequate, which was why I had eventually gone to the VA. The VA had assigned me a 30% disability rating. 30% meant approximately $500 per month. 30% meant the VA assessed my PTSD as causing occupational and social impairment that was real but manageable with outpatient treatment. 30% was not wrong in the sense of being false. It was wrong in the sense of being incomplete. It assessed the surface of my functioning without accounting for the specific cost of producing that surface, the work that went into appearing manageable, the specific constructed quality of a life organized around avoiding triggers, the fact that I had Atlas and had built my schedule around Atlas and had chosen my work and my neighborhood and my son's school route, all in part based on what Atlas could help me manage. I worked, I parented, I maintained a household, I was present for Jack in the specific way that Kate would have wanted me to be present. The VA looked at this and saw manageable. What they did not see was the machinery underneath. Atlas had come into my life in April 2023. He had been trained by a nonprofit called Idaho Canine Partners, a Boise organization that trained PTSD service dogs for veterans and placed them at no cost. I had applied in 2022. The training process for Atlas had taken 18 months before he was placed with me, and the 2 of us had then gone through 6 weeks of joint training so that we understood each other's cues and responses, and so that Atlas understood my specific symptom profile. My specific symptom profile included hypervigilance in enclosed public spaces, avoidance of loud, sudden sounds, sleep disruption with specific nightmare patterns, and occasional dissociative episodes triggered by audio stimuli, specifically by voices that reproduced the specific quality of radio communications from the 2015 deployment. The 2015 deployment had included an event that I will describe simply. My team had been in radio contact with a unit that was in contact, and I had heard on the radio the specific progression of a situation that I could not affect and that ended in a way that I had been hearing, in some form, in my sleep, for 9 years. Atlas was trained to respond to the early signs of these episodes: grounding, pressing against my legs, blocking, positioning himself between me and the environment, interruption, physical contact to break the loop. He had, in 18 months, made my life measurably better. He had also made it measurably visible, the specific paradox of a service dog, which was that his presence announced my condition to everyone who saw him while simultaneously making the condition more manageable. I had explained this to Lynn Carver, my attorney, in our preparation for the hearing. Lynn was 43 years old and had been practicing veterans law for 15 years. She had the specific quality of someone who had spent 15 years arguing for people who had not been seen correctly by the institution, tasked with seeing them, and who had developed, in the arguing, a precise understanding of what the institution responded to and what it did not. She had said, "The VA looks at your functioning and sees a 30%. I need them to see what produces the functioning." I had said, "How do you show them that?" She had said, "We show them Atlas. We show them what Atlas does and when he does it, and we argue that the need for Atlas is itself evidence of severity." I had said, "And if Atlas doesn't do anything during the hearing?" She had said, "Then we rely on the medical evidence, which is strong." She had not said, "and hope." She had not needed to. The hearing room was 12 feet by 15 feet. I had done the room check before I went in, the specific Atlas procedure that allowed me to enter enclosed spaces that would otherwise trigger avoidance. Atlas went in first, checked the room, returned to me. I entered. The room had a table, chairs, recording equipment, and the specific institutional quality of a space that had been designed for formal proceedings, and that communicated this through its furnishings without warmth. Veterans Law Judge Margaret Byrne was 58 years old and had been a judge for the Board of Veterans' Appeals for 11 years. She had the quality of someone who had heard many cases and who had not allowed the hearing of many cases to become routine in the sense of careless. She was present, she was precise, and she communicated through her manner that she intended to give this case the attention it required. Gerald Price represented the VA's position. He was 51 years old and had the quality of someone who was doing his job correctly and who did not have a personal investment in the outcome. He was not a villain. He was a person who had been given a position to represent and who was representing it. Lynn Carver sat beside me. Atlas was under the table at my feet. The hearing proceeded. Lynn presented the medical evidence, my diagnosis records, the clinical assessments from 2020 through 2024, the documentation of Atlas's placement and training records, the specific symptom profile that the VA had assessed at 30% and that Lynn argued was consistent with 70%. Gerald Price presented the VA's position, that my functioning was inconsistent with the 70% rating, which required occupational and social impairment with deficiencies in most areas, and that my work history, parenting record, and social functioning indicated a level of impairment more consistent with 50% at most. Judge Byrne asked questions. She was direct, and she asked the right ones, the questions that went to the quality of the functioning rather than the surface of it. I answered. I answered honestly and completely, which was the only way I knew how to answer, and which was also, Lynn had told me, the most effective approach. Not because judges rewarded honesty particularly, they heard honest testimony regularly, but because the specific quality of someone who had been managing something for years and who could articulate the management was its own form of evidence. And then Gerald Price played the audio, or exhibit. It was from my 2020 VA psychological evaluation, a recorded session in which the psychologist had asked me to describe my most significant combat experience. I had described it completely. The radio, the voices, the progression, what I had heard and could not affect. I had described it in 2020 in a clinical setting where I had been prepared to describe it. I was not prepared to hear it. The recording played through the room's speakers. My own voice, 4 years younger, describing the specific thing that lived in the architecture of my sleep. The dissociative response was not dramatic. I did not fall or shake or make a sound. What happened was interior, the specific unwinding of the present moment, the way the room became less real and the past became more real, and the 12 by 15 space became something else entirely. I had my hand on Atlas before I knew I had moved it. Atlas moved. He came out from under the table. He positioned himself between my chair and the area where Gerald Price was standing, not aggressively, not with any sign of distress. Simply present, blocking. A 78-pound German Shepherd standing in the specific trained way of a dog who had identified that his person needed a barrier between himself and the environment and who had provided it. The hearing room was 12 feet by 15 feet. Atlas occupied a significant portion of the available space. The recording stopped. Judge Byrne said, "Mr. Ritter." I had my hand on Atlas's back. I was breathing. I said, "Give me a moment." She gave me a moment. 45 seconds. I said, "I'm here." She said, "Thank you." She looked at Atlas. She looked at the space Atlas was occupying. She looked at me. She said, "Mr. Ritter, what just happened is the most compelling evidence I've heard today." Gerald Price did not object. Lynn Carver did not say anything. She had told me before the hearing that the most important thing I could do was to be honest and to trust the evidence. The evidence had just presented itself. Judge Byrne made a note. She said, "I want to note for the record that during the presentation of Exhibit 14C, a recorded psychological evaluation, this court observed the appellant's trained PTSD service dog perform an unsolicited blocking intervention. The intervention lasted approximately 45 seconds and concluded when the appellant verbally confirmed his reorientation to the present. This court considers this observation directly relevant to the question of the severity of the appellant's service-connected PTSD. She said it in the specific language of legal records. What it meant in the specific language of human beings was, I saw what happened, and I am going to say so. Oliver was still in the waiting room when I came out. Peter Kane was beside him, on his phone, doing what parents did in waiting rooms when the waiting had gone longer than expected. Oliver had his hand on the back of the chair beside him, the specific, still quality of a child who had been waiting carefully and who had not moved from the place where the waiting had started. He said, "How did it go?" I said, "I think it went well." He said, "Did Atlas help?" I said, "Yes, he did." Oliver said, "I knew he would." I said, "How did you know?" He said, "Because he's Atlas. He holds things up." I looked at my dog. I looked at this 7-year-old boy who had found me by the sound of my breathing and who had waited in the place where the waiting had started while I was in the hearing room, staying connected through the specific patience of a child who understood that some things required waiting for. Peter Kane had put his phone down. He said, "How long have you had him?" I said, 18 months. He said, "What does he do?" I said, "He helps me be here, in the present, when the past gets loud." Peter looked at his son. He said, "Oliver has been working with service dog organizations since he was 5. He wants to train them." I said, "He told me." Peter said, "He's serious about it." I said, "I know, I could tell." Oliver said, "Can I tell you something?" I said, "Yes." He said, "When I sat down next to you, I could hear that you were working hard. You're breathing. You were doing something with your breathing." I said, "Yes." He said, "My mom does that. She has anxiety. She does the same thing." I said, "Does it help when she does it?" He said, "Yes, but she says it's hard to do it alone." I said, "It is." He said, "That's why you have Atlas." I said, "Yes, that's why I have Atlas." He said, "And Atlas has you." I looked at my dog. Atlas was sitting beside me with the specific quality of a dog who was entirely present in the current moment and who did not carry the weight of the previous one. I said, "Yes, and Atlas has me." The letter came 6 weeks later, a Tuesday morning in December. I was making Jack's lunch, the specific Tuesday morning routine, Jack at the kitchen table with his cereal and his book, Atlas in his spot by the back door where the morning light came through in the specific way that Atlas had decided was his spot and that I had agreed to call his spot. The letter was from the Board of Veterans' Appeals. I read it twice, 70%. I set it on the kitchen table. I sat down. Jack looked up from his book. He said, "What is it?" I said, "A letter from the VA." He said, "What does it say?" I said, "It says they've changed my rating." He said, "Is that good?" I said, "Yes, it's very good." He said, "Why?" I thought about how to explain this. I thought about the specific difficulty of explaining to a 9-year-old the difference between the number that described your need and the resources the number unlocked, and the specific injustice of a system in which the better you managed your condition, the less the institution believed you needed help managing it. I said, "It means they understand better now, what it takes for me to be okay." He said, "Did Atlas help?" I said, "Yes." He said, "How?" I said, "He did what he does. He showed them what he does for me. He made it visible. Jack looked at Atlas by the back door. He said, "Dad." I said, "Yeah." He said, "Atlas always does that." I said, "What?" He said, "Makes things visible when you need him to." I said, "Yes, he does." Jack went back to his book. Atlas was in his spot by the back door in the Tuesday morning light, doing what Atlas did, being entirely present, watching the room with the specific quality of a dog who had decided that the room and the people in it were his responsibility and who took the responsibility seriously. I thought about Oliver in the waiting room. He holds things up. I thought about the 45 seconds in the hearing room, the hand on Atlas's back, the breathing, the coming back. I thought about the letter on the table. The VA had seen me, not because I had asked them to see me differently. I had asked that for 4 years, through the proper channels. They had seen me because Atlas had shown them something that the paperwork and the testimony and the medical records had described, but that the room had needed to contain before the describing was enough. A German shepherd standing in a 12 by 15 room with his body between his person and the thing that was making the present unlivable. That was the evidence. That was always the evidence. I had been managing for a long time. I had been managing so well that the institution tasked with helping me had decided I needed less help. I had been carrying the specific weight of being seen as more functional than I was, which was a weight that the people carrying it were not supposed to have to carry. The letter said 70%. The letter said, "We see the machinery." That was enough. That was more than enough. I picked up the letter and folded it and put it in the drawer where I kept the things I wanted to keep. Atlas came in from his spot by the door. He put his head in my lap. I put my hand on the back of his neck and sat in the kitchen on a Tuesday morning in December in Boise, Idaho, with my son reading at the table and my dog's head in my lap, and the specific quality of a moment that was entirely and completely present, which was the thing I had been working toward for a long time, and which was, on this morning, available to me. That was the whole thing. That was always the whole thing. Before you go, I want to ask you something. Has there been a moment when someone, a person, an animal, a child, made visible something you had been carrying alone? Something you had been managing so well that the people who were supposed to help you couldn't see that you needed it? Sometimes the most important thing isn't the help itself. It's being seen correctly first. Tell me about it in the comments. I read every single one. If this story stayed with you today, share it with one person who needs to hear it. You already know who that is. And if you're new here, subscribe. Every week, a story like this one. Real people, real decisions, the kind that stay with you.